Azad Awaz is a monthly patrika that focuses on the marginalized sections of the society whose voices are often muted in the cacophony of flashy mainstream media discourse. When referring to marginalization, this platform does not aim to restrict itself to the traditional focus on social aggregates like caste and race alone, but also aspires to include a discussion on class, gender identity, environmentalism, etc. This month's Patrika attempts to focus on the concept of environmental law, policies, and activism. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a looming environmental crisis faces the globe. It warns of long-lasting or irreversible environmental impact. For climate change, if rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented global changes in most aspects of social life are not immediately implemented to limit global warming to acceptable levels. The central question we propose to explore is why the Indian environmental laws and policies have failed to bring about environmental justice. This interview will focus on analyzing the Environmental Impact Assessment Draft of 2020 and to what extent has this strayed from the environmental policies and ethics. Today, we have Dr. Kanchi Kohli, who is a senior researcher at the Center for Policy Research. Her work explores the links between law, industrialization, and environment justice. She has authored various publications, research papers, and popular articles. She has also co-edited the book Business Interests and Environmental Crisis by Sage India. Since 2004, she has also co-coordinates on information dissemination service on forest and wildlife cases in the Supreme Court of India. She co-edited The Case for Commons, a 6-part e-publication on the administrative follow-up of the 2011 Supreme Court of India judgment on the protection of commons. She has also co-authored a book called Development of Environmental Laws in India, published by the Cambridge University Press. Her research interests also include the implementation of biodiversity regulations in India. We're so glad to have you today with us, ma'am.
Thank you for having me.
Ma'am, I wanted to start off by talking about the draft EIA 2020. And according to you, what is the relationship between the state and the environment? And to what extent is this relationship defined or aided by the anthropocentric nature of environmental law and vice versa? And what are some of the other factors that determine the relationship between the state and environment?
Yeah, so I think, the EIA 2020 is a regulatory tool that the state uses, basically to be able to regulate the impacts of environment, etc. But before we get into that, I think the question that you're asking is, what is the relationship between the state and the environment? And I think that question can be answered from, understanding the constitutional duty of the state, the legal mandate of the state, and the ethical basis on which environment needs to be protected. So constitutionally, I think the state has, there are very clear articles enshrined in the constitution which actually require the state to, the government to protect the environment. So Article 41A, 48A, 51AG requires every citizen to has a fundamental duty to protect the environment. And in order to be able, for the citizens to be able to do that, state has to play a facilitative role, has to play a supportive role. So that's the constitutional basis. Then we have a plethora of laws and policies and regulations that enable states to be able to do that. Some of it has come from international conventions, some of it is from demands locally, all of that. So they're sector specific, they're procedure specific, they're regulatory in nature, all of that. But I think, one of the questions that the state and governments have to ask themselves in today's time, especially when we are repeatedly seeing, in a post-COVID world, a post-climate change, impacted world, is the ethical duty of the government to actually protect the environment, because everything else then follows, after that. And in terms of the anthropocentric influence, I think, the very fact that governments and people are having to engage with, the question of environment, there's always been an anthropocentric approach to the environment. In fact, the concept of sustainable development is extremely anthropocentric in nature. It's basically, we want it for a particular purpose. So I think ultimately, it's how governments nationally, internationally, locally prioritize the question of environment and not make it a collateral. In the process of economic development is the question we need to look at, address at every given point of time.
Thank you, ma'am. So another question I had was that the EIA draft notification of 2020 has been condemned for various issues, such as lack of public consultation, post facto approval, less stringent rules, and exemption of certain industries from environment clearance. The Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has also stated that accepting economic growth, facilitating the ease of doing business, and reducing any obstacles to development are some of the reasons behind this draft. The question is, where and why do you think that catering to the environment and indigenous communities becomes an obstacle to the development of the country?
So I think, one of the first questions that, so there are two parts to what you're saying. One is about this whole question of development and how the EIA actually fits in to the whole thing, whole debate. The thing is, we need to, and I think you all know it, and everybody knows it. Development, the idea of development is a political construct. It's about how you and what kind of lifestyle or being are we envisioning ourselves to be in? Is it concrete led development? Is it nature led development? Is it a balanced development? All of that. So it's actually a political construct, and it's always been that. What is the idea of good life that we are looking at? What is the idea? What is good? What is bad? I mean, it really centers around all of these things. So, and there's always a play. There's geopolitics. There is national level politics. There are caste angles. There are class angles. There are a whole bunch of angles. So the social dimension of this whole question is really big. So because development is a political construct, before answering your question in terms of why do indigenous communities and environment, why are they seen as an obstacle? The thing is, if we ask, is environment and communities, local communities, and definitely communities of a certain class, caste, status, are they at the center of this idea of development, or are they at the margins? Yeah. Now let's look at this with the idea of how procedures like the EIA or land acquisition or anything like that deal with the question of common lands, yeah, in the country. Now, common lands are often termed as wastelands. So if we all know about the idea of wastelands, it's like, okay, nothing is unproductive, nothing can happen here, etc. But these lands are the arid lands, which are extremely important for their own biodiversity. They're also very important for pastoral communities, for grazing, all the occupations that are not considered to be productive or high value, etc. So if these ideas, from the very beginning, if you're actually politically constructing common lands as wastelands, the moment they come into an EIA procedure, they'll be dispensable. Both these occupations will be the lands will be dispensable and the occupation will be dispensable. So it's the conclusion will be it's not high impact. So the impacts are not much, so it can be replaced. So I think the idea of development is such a political construct that how we apply it, and each person applying their own value while regulating the environment becomes a big question here, and there are expert committees that come with their own biases in the whole thing. So that, yeah. Of course, I think you would also, I don't know if you already asked that, but I think I remember the questions that you'd sent, the issue of, how do we deal with alternatives when it comes to this?
I was just going to ask you, that what are some of the effective alternatives to preserve the environment by checking environmentally degrading development projects?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. See, the thing is, it's like the idea of alternatives has been, it's actually, if you look at the EIA procedures, the question of alternatives is already there. because EI procedures are meant to regulate, right? They're meant to actually help government take good decisions. Now, building from what I've been saying so far, the idea of alternatives really comes up in a big way, because the EI, for instance, in the EI procedure, if you ask a question about is there any alternative for actually citing a particular development project here? Is there any alternative for this kind of energy generation, etc.? So these are all questions that can be asked through this process. Now, but if you see the kind of answers you get in the application forms and projects, etc., the answers you'll get is like, okay, there'll be one document that will say that's going to fragment really thick forests and highly important forests for indigenous communities in central India. They'll say, well, there is no alternative to coal. Yeah, the answer to that question about are there any alternatives? They'll say there's no alternative to coal. Now, if you change the gaze and you say, is there any alternative for elephants? Is there any alternatives for the forest produce that people get from that forest? Is there any alternative for the river that flows and depends on that forest? It's how you approach that question, and that's why I keep your approach to that question is a political construct, really.
Yes, ma'am. So this is something that people usually don't look at it from this perspective, which you so rightly said. Ma'am, also historically, the EIA has merely had effect of legitimizing environmentally degrading actions, and there's practically been zero disapprovals of profits under the clearance mechanism since 1999. So is there a requirement to retrace and replace the EIA, or is it reconstruction of the mechanism involved sufficient?
I think, see, there is no denying that environment impact assessment procedures across the world require a review. There is no denying that. They were introduced in the late 80s, early 90s across the globe as package laws through very international financial institutions like the World Bank were involved. They were introduced as package laws to say that, okay, there is going to be high level investment in economic growth or financial investment in priority sectors like infrastructure growth, etc., mining, etc., in these countries. So you do need a process by which environment impact assessments have to be carried out, and a good decision has to be taken by the government. Now, that was, that's a few decades back. So definitely when EI procedures were introduced in different parts of the country, including India, there's the huge legacy of projects that have gone through this regulatory net were not there. Yeah, we didn't have that pool of projects that the 15,000 plus projects that just gone through the Environment Ministry's net that they claim, or this doesn't include all those which have not gone through the net. So all those projects, that's a whole legacy. The idea of retrospective EIAs was never spoken about. For instance, you've done an EIA in 1994 or 96 or 1908. There is a limit to human ability and scientific ability to predict impacts or to design mitigation measures. That is why repeatedly the idea was that you need to go back and see whether what you predicted came true or not. So, and that can inform good decisions in the future. So there is definitely a need to bring that into the EIA procedures. And what I'm saying is actually been said by several people. We did not have the kind of although the conversation had started, but the issues of climate change, public health, these are very critical components, but which EIA procedures don't talk about. And finally, I think when it comes to public participation, right now EIA procedures, even however compromised, they actually universally apply to anybody who wants to participate, right? I mean, anybody, even from the local community point of view, that you want to participate. But it doesn't recognize that communities are not a monolith. There are huge social hierarchies in communities. So the EIA procedures have to respond to being able to hear the voices of everybody who's going to be impacted by these projects, and whether it's you know, a caste wise, you know, so basically EI is extremely caste blind or class blind or gender blind, you know. So these are all issues that we need to bring in as a progressive way to take EI procedures for, you know, forward, other than many other things, you know, of delinking EI consultants with project proponents, all of the financial arrangements, all of that has to be. So definitely the EI procedure requires a review, but it needs to be scaling up the review rather than reading it down. You know?
Thank you, ma'am. So the last question that I had, so what are some of the changes made in the clearance process through the EIA 2020 notification, which has had an effect of the whittling down of the regulatory mechanisms enshrined within the EIA? What are some of the implications of these changes, and to what extent have the amendments caused the clearance process to stray from the precautionary principle on which the EIA has been based?
So, I mean, see, one of the things that what the government has also spoken about, and we all know about, and a lot of you who have also studied about it know about, is that the EIA 2020 was a compilation of all the changes that had been happening for a very long time, and more, you know, so, and plus. So all the exemptions and exceptions that were already in place through office memorandum circulars, piecemeal amendments, all of that were kind of condensed into the EIA 2020 and plus. So you actually add, there were projects that were exempted either from the entire procedure or from parts of the procedure, or so exemptions and exceptions is definitely part of the EIA 2020 that came up. The EIA 2020 hugely read down and it was basically talking about as part of the exemptions and exceptions, and also how it related to the idea of public participation. It completely kind of again saw it as a bureaucratic process that needs to be completed, rather than a democratic process that needs to be undertaken by the state to a certain good decision or to arrive at good decisions. So it was like a bureaucratic tick off that you need to go through it, quickly done, you know, this kind of format. So it's basically how files would move rather than actually how people have to be involved in decision making. So that was the second thing that happened, which had begun to happen for a while, but it was kind of embraced in a big way in the EIA 2020. The EIA 2020, actually, we all know about it, and again, extensively we've spoken about it. In fact, the Ministry of Environment has introduced a standard operating protocol on related to how they will deal with violation-related projects. That was embedded in an EIA in the EIA 2020, draft EIA 2020 in a big way. Now, that became hugely problematic because this was not a one-time amnesty scheme that they had introduced earlier, but it was going to be, you know, a standard operating protocol consistently at any given point of time in the EIA process, which was, so there was absolutely no deterrence against non-compliance except for the fact that you will have to pay for damages, you know, or you'll have to deal with the state or have a shut up for a while, if at all, of your operations. So the way the government's approach to violations was not of deterrence, but was of actually trying to bring recognition that you need to bring a whole bunch of projects in the regulatory net, but there is a way to regularize them. It's one of those, as my colleague Manju has actually spoke about it the other day. She said, I think it was mentioned in one of the newspapers, she said, this is going to be one of the biggest regularization drives for development projects in the country. And finally, actually, it did nothing still on how the government is going to deal with the issues of non-compliance of say environmental safeguards and conditions, which is the biggest legacy of the EIA process right now in the country, which has to be addressed. All the polluting landscapes, degradation, forest encroachments, all of that, which can be addressed through the non-compliance of conditions, labor conditions, all of that. It is still very, very weak inside. So, I mean, the implications is that decisions under the EIA process or from the environmental approval process is not a mere legal decision. It has huge impacts on ecology. It has impacts on society. It has impacts on health, a whole bunch of factors. So, you have to see it in those terms and recognize the ethical importance of EIA processes rather than a procedural tick off that you go ahead with it. And what it does to precaution, all of these 4 factors that I spoke about are definitely that do not uphold the precautionary principle. It is based on all other principles of, largely the polluter pays principle or rather it's not even polluter pays, it's pay and pollute sort of principles that it takes forward. So, I mean, precaution has gradually moved away from the EIA process. It's still structurally part of it, but it's gradually moved away, and all the bunch of exemptions, exceptions, how the government is treating violations, seriously undermine the idea of precaution when the world requires it even more today.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think this was it. These are some of the questions that I had, but thank you so much for being with us and talking about this.
Anytime.